Tufts have a fascinating real animal as our mascot, who lived on this earth during a fascinating moment in history and was connected to big events, big people, and the stuff of history itself. It starts with P.T. Barnum becoming a trustee of Tufts. He was a founding trustee of the university. P.T. Barnum was, without question, the most famous entertainment impresario of the 19th century and the biggest circus man that ever was. Barnum had decided to create a museum of natural history on the Tufts campus. Animals from Barnum's circus were the stock, so to speak, of the Natural History Museum. He had in mind to give Jumbo to Tufts when that horrible day arrived that Jumbo was no longer with the circus. Jumbo's life began with what must have been a traumatic separation from his mother on the savannas of Africa. He was a wild elephant caught in an area which is now on the border between Eritrea and Sudan. And he was sold by Hamran nomadic people to an animal trader from Europe, from Germany. And he slowly made his way with other exotic animals from Africa through the Red Sea, across the Mediterranean, into Germany. He was briefly at the Paris Zoo, but that didn't last long. And his fame and popularity really began in London, where he remained for about 17 years. When he arrived in London from Paris, he wasn't in great health. It's clear that he was slowly nursed back into good health by his keepers at the London Zoo, and in particular a man by the name of Matthew Scott, who became his inseparable friend for the rest of Jumbo's life. There was nothing to suggest at first that he would go on to become the animal that he became. But within about 5 years of arriving at the zoo, we start to see illustrations of Jumbo giving rides to children. Not all elephants would allow that, but Jumbo did. And it's really from that moment onwards, I think, that the public really starts to take to Jumbo. Tens of thousands of children rode on his back, including some famous people, including Queen Victoria's children, the young Winston Churchill, Teddy Roosevelt. And Jumbo was anthropomorphized in different ways. He supposedly fell in love with and married a female elephant at the zoo named Alice, after Alice in Wonderland. He was still far from being full grown when this began, but he grew, and as he grew, he became more fascinating to the public and remained as gentle as ever. The zoo records show, however, that after he passed the age of 20, he entered into the elephant equivalent of puberty, during which time male elephants become rather difficult to control. And the zoo rightly worried that Jumbo might go berserk during public hours, and they simply didn't know what to do with him. Barnum, who was always on the lookout for new acts, got wind of the problems that the zoo was having with Jumbo, and elephants were crucial to the circus owing to people's fascination with them. But Jumbo stood out from the other elephants by virtue of his size and his celebrity. He knew that Jumbo would draw crowds unlike any other single creature. Barnum and his partner Bailey felt that they could manage Jumbo, and so made the zoo an offer they couldn't refuse. And the deal was quickly settled, and Jumbo was handed over to Barnum. It was only when Jumbo refused to leave the zoo that the public first started to take notice. It took several weeks of patient coaxing to get Jumbo to enter the enormous traveling case that had been constructed. It garnered immense sympathy for the animal. 10,000 to 15,000 people went to the zoo every day to pay their respects, to take him food, to protest the sale. It was an extraordinary public outcry. Queen Victoria and other public officials made clear their disappointment. All of it failed, and Barnum eventually won, and off Jumbo went to America. Because we don't know much about what Jumbo's journey was like, a space was created to inject fantasy and imagination, one might say. So we do have these fanciful accounts of Jumbo dancing the hornpipe with sailors on board. It was said that one way of calming Jumbo coming across the Atlantic and to encourage him to get on the boat in the first place was to give him whiskey. P.T. Barnum understood what captivated the human imagination better than anyone of his time or arguably since. And he understood that we are fascinated by things unusually large and unusually small. He began life exhibiting performers of different sorts and taking them on the road, including Tom Thumb, who was an undersized human being, probably the most famous sort of stage act of the 19th century. He was a great performer, a great mimic, a great stage presence. But size was an important feature of Tom Thumb's celebrity. And so Jumbo appealed to him as the biggest animal, and it was certainly appropriate for him to seek Jumbo out as the sort of face of what Barnum himself called the greatest show on earth. Barnum, being a marketing genius, made sure that Jumbo's arrival in this country was accompanied by hoopla unlike any other event in recent memory. Some 10,000 people lined the route from Battery Park in New York City, where Jumbo arrived, to Madison Square Gardens, which was the home of the circus at the time. It was the largest crowd reported in New York City to date. Attendance for the circus that year broke all previous records. He led the troupe of performers around the circus ring to open the circus, in effect. But he did very little aside from show himself to the crowds. Jumbo was simply there to be seen and to be admired and gawked at. Jumbo's arrival in the United States in the early 1880s coincided with the explosion of consumer products and consumer advertising. And Jumbo was used from the outset, from the moment he arrived in this country, to advertise an extraordinary range of products and services. And so it built upon itself and rippled across the 20th century. The word jumbo hadn't been known or used before in the English language before he came along, and it has since become the byword for anything humongous or supersized. So every time we use the word jumbo jet or jumbotron, we are actually referring back to Jumbo the elephant. And Jumbo was a celebrity, and in that sense, he would be quite familiar to us today in our celebrity-hungry culture. Compared to other circus elephants at the time, Jumbo led a charmed life. He was treated specially. He seemingly maintained his health. He was gentle, well-behaved. Whether that means he was happy as an animal, who knows? He logged about 32,000 miles on the railway with Barnum Circus, in and out of circus cars performing. So it was a pretty tough, arduous existence. It would be fair to say that he endured his life. Jumbo died in a tragic train accident in September of 1885 in a small town by the name of St. Thomas in Ontario. The animals were being led down the train track after performing, and all of a sudden, unexpectedly, a train came round the bend, a freight train that had been unanticipated, unexpected, unscheduled. And the animals were quickly moved off the train track. But the problem for Jumbo was that he was unusually large and so difficult to move. He was struck from behind and died soon thereafter. There was immediate panic among the circus partners. But Barnum had lived through umpteen catastrophes across his career. Nothing fazed him. Barnum fashioned a story that he charged the oncoming train and sacrificed his life to save that of a baby elephant in the circus. And in fact, he'd already arranged with a noted taxidermist, a man by the name of Henry Ward of Rochester, to drop whatever he was doing and to rush to wherever it was that Jumbo died and to begin work preparing Jumbo as a stationary, fixed, stuffed animal. It seems that it was decided on the spot to also save his bones and articulate the skeleton. Double Jumbo, 2 Jumbos for the price of 1. He knew that Jumbo could have an afterlife at the circus. And as long as Jumbo was making good money on the road with the circus, he delayed following through on the promise to give Jumbo to Tufts. And indeed, Jumbo proved as popular dead as he was alive. But gradually over time, it seems that the public did tire of seeing Jumbo. Barnum eventually decided that the time was right to give the skeleton to the Smithsonian and the stuffed Jumbo to Tufts. Jumbo was wrapped up and sent by train to North Somerville Station. He was then drawn by horse and wagon. The horse and cart were unable to pull Jumbo up the hill. Some 50 professors, students, and local boys were brought out to push the wagon up the hill. When the wagon arrived on campus, however, it was realized that the mounted specimen was too large to get through the door. So they had to disassemble the entrance to get him in. They had to remove the stone stairs, they had to remove the keystone and part of the arch that surrounded the entrance. Barnum sent a note saying, "I'm happy that you have Jumbo. I promised him to you. Here he is. However, I may want to borrow him again because we have in mind a big circus extravaganza, taking the circus back to London again." And sure enough, the whole process had to happen all over again. Jumbo was reinstalled some months later, and that was that. The museum remained popular through the 1920s. By the 1930s, however, its usefulness as a natural history museum had passed. And so a decision was made at the end of the 1930s to clear all of the animal specimens except Jumbo. The Barnum building was turned into a student lounge with Jumbo as its centerpiece. Photographs show students relaxing, interacting with each other, studying for exams in the shadow of the great pachyderm. All those little ways, all those little rituals and interactions with him make it clear that he had won the hearts of the students here and that he was really theirs as their mascot. All was normal until one night in April of 1975 when an electrical fire broke out at night and burned the building to a cinder. Much was lost. Student work, professors' work and research, and unfortunately Jumbo was also lost. The morning after the fire, an employee entered the building to save some of the ashes from the burnt Jumbo, and all that was to hand was an empty peanut butter jar. The other thing that survives is Jumbo's tail. Jumbo's tail had actually been pulled off by a mischievous student, so it was in the Tufts archives when the building burnt. And today, that together with the jar of ashes is what survives of our mascot. His life intersected with so many important strands in modern American history. The rise of popular entertainment, mass entertainment, of museums, of celebrity itself, of advertising. But it would be impossible to say really what the quality of his life was. And I think it illustrates the complicated and shifting relationship that human beings have had with animals over a very long period of time. So that's quite a span, really, of identities from wild animal, zoo, circus creature, museum specimen, college mascot. One animal has had to endure that kind of transition. His legend, his mythology lasted well into the 20th century and really explain why we took to the word Jumbo to mean anything that is larger than life, unusually big, and why it still has currency in our language today.